Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Learning Stethoscope. In this video, we're going to talk about lung volumes, lung capacities, and spirometry. These are really important concepts in respiratory physiology and help us differentiate between obstructive and restrictive lung diseases. Let's start with the basics. Here we have a graph. On the x-axis, we have the time in seconds. And on the y-axis, we have the lungs volume expressed in liters of air. Now, going up the y-axis is the inspiration, meaning the air we breathe in. And going down on the y-axis is the expiration, so the volume of air when we breathe out. Lung volumes consist of the different amounts of air that move in and out of our lungs during breathing. Think of our lungs like a balloon. You can breathe in a little, or you can breathe in a lot. So you can fill up your lungs with different amounts of air depending on how deeply you breathe in or out. All these different volumes and actions have names. The first and most basic lung volume is the tidal volume. So imagine that you are just sitting quietly in your living room and you are just breathing normally. You breathe in and breathe out. The amount of air you breathe in and out during this normal and relaxed breathing is called tidal volume, or TV. And for most adults, it's about 0.5 liters, which is roughly the size of a small water bottle. Now, let's say you take a breath that's much deeper than normal, like a really big breath in. That extra air you inhale on top of a regular breath is called the inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV. It's basically the extra space your lungs can fill when you really need it. For example, imagine you're about to blow out a birthday candle, or take a dive underwater. Remember that big and deep breath you take before? That's your IRV. In most adults, it's around 3 liters of air. Now imagine you've just finished a normal breath, but then you keep going and breathe out even more air. That extra air you push out after a normal exhale is called the expiratory reserve volume, or ERV. In most adults, is around 1.1 liters. Finally, no matter how hard you try to breathe out, there's always some air that stays in your lungs. This is called the residual volume, or RV. It's the air that you can't exhale even with your strongest effort. This residual air is essential because it keeps your alveoli open, preventing them from collapsing and helping them maintain continuous oxygen exchange between breaths. Is about 1.2 liters. So these are the 4 lung volumes. Now let's move on to lung capacities. These are just combinations of the volumes we just talked about. So when we add these volumes together, we get lung capacities. First up is the inspiratory capacity. This is how much air you can breathe in starting from a normal exhale. So basically, is a normal breath in, meaning the tidal volume, plus a deep breath in, so the inspiratory reserve volume. Next is the functional residual capacity, which is how the amount of air that is left in the lungs after a normal exhale. So that's your expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. This resting volume is important because it keeps gas exchange going. Then we have the vital capacity, or VC. This is the biggest breath you can take in and then blow out. In other words, is the maximum amount of air you can exhale after a deep breath in. So basically, it's sum of all the volumes except the residual volume, so the tidal volume, plus the inspiratory reserve volume, plus the expiratory reserve volume. Finally, the largest number is the total lung capacity, or TLC, which is the sum of all the 4 volumes, the inspiratory reserve volume, plus the tidal volume, plus the expiratory reserve volume, plus the residual volume. This is the total amount of air your lungs can hold, even the air that never leaves your lungs. That's about 6 liters in a healthy adult. All right, now that you know about lung volumes and capacities, we can talk about spirometry. Spirometry is a common lung function test. It's simple and quick, and it helps doctors understand how well your lungs are working. It measures how much air you can move and how fast you can move it. Basically, in a spirometry test, you breathe in deeply and then blow out as hard and fast as you can into a tube that is usually connected to a computer or machine that records your results. This way, we can measure the amount and velocity of the air that your lungs can move. From a spirometry test, we can get several informations. One of the graphs that we can get is the flow volume loop. On the x-axis, we have the lung volume, from 0 to usually 6 liters. On the y-axis, we have the airflow rate, expressed in liters per second. So, on this flow volume loop, the person takes a deep breath, and this is the inspiration phase, and then the person breathes out forcefully, and this is the expiration phase. This sharp rise as the person blows the air out is called the peak expiratory flow. In healthy lungs, this graph looks like a mountain and a valley, where on the expiratory phase we have a smooth and tall mountain, and on the inspiratory phase we have a rounded and symmetrical valley. Now let's take a look at another graph, the volume time curve. We have the time on the x-axis in seconds, and on the y-axis we have the volume of air in the lungs in liters. Remember that 6 liters is the total lung capacity in humans. One of the key values we look at is the forced vital capacity, or FVC. This is the total amount of air you can blow out after taking a deep breath in, measured during forced exhalation. So imagine you take a maximal breath in and then you breathe it all out as hard and fast as you can. And the total volume of air you manage to exhale is equal to the forced vital capacity. It's basically the same thing as the vital capacity, but is measured with effort because you're forcing the air out. Hence the name forced. This FVC is a very important measure because it helps us understand how much air our lungs can actually move. In this case, let's say it's 5 liters, and the air remaining in the lungs after the forced expiration is the residual volume. Now, the measure of how much air comes out in the first second during this forced expiration is called the forced expiratory volume in 1 second, or FEV1. So imagine, you take a big breath in and then blow out hard and fast. The measure of how much air comes out in the first second is the FEV1. This is also an important measure, because it tells us how fast air is coming out of our lungs and how quickly your lungs can empty. So if your airways are open and healthy, you should be able to blow out most of your air in the first second. But if your airways are narrow or inflamed, it's harder to blow the air out quickly, so your FEV1 goes down. In this case, let's say it's 4 liters. Now, with these two measurements, we can calculate the FEV1 to FVC ratio, also known as the Tifano index. This is simply the FEV1 divided by the FVC, and it compares how much air you can blow out in the first second versus to the total amount you can blow out in one big breath. So, it's the percentage of the air that comes out in the first second. In healthy adults, you can blow out most of the air quickly, so the ratio is high, usually higher than 80% or 0.8. We can use spirometry to tell the difference between the two main types of lung diseases: obstructive and restrictive lung diseases. In obstructive diseases, the main problem is that it's hard to get air out of the lungs because the airways are narrowed, inflamed, or collapsed. Imagine blowing air through a narrow straw. The air comes out slowly, and it takes more effort. That's exactly what happens in obstructive lung diseases like asthma or COPD. When you breathe in, you can usually get air into your lungs without too much trouble. But when you try to breathe out, the narrow airways slow down the air leaving your lungs. This makes it hard to push all the air out quickly. As a result, air gets trapped inside the lungs after each breath. This causes some key changes in lung volumes. Volumes like residual volume and functional residual capacity go up. In severe cases like emphysema, the lungs get so stretched out and overfilled that even the total lung capacity increases. This trapped air causes the lungs to become overinflated, like a balloon stretched bigger than usual. If we take a look at the flow volume graph, we have the normal inspiration and normal expiration in a dotted line. In obstructive diseases, the whole graph shifts to the left because we have an increase in residual volume and in total lung capacity. We can also see that the expiration curve looks scooped out or concave, with an appearance similar to a banana. Also, the peak flow is reduced slightly because of the narrow airways and obstruction. Obstructive diseases also have some key changes in the spirometry results. Since the air can't get out quickly because the airways are narrow, the FEV1 is reduced. But the FVC might be normal or slightly reduced because eventually the person can get most of the air out. It just takes longer to do so. So if we take a look at the Tiffinot index, if the FEV1 is reduced and the FVC stays normal or only slightly lower, this means that the ratio decreases significantly. And if the ratio drops below 70%, this is diagnostic for obstructive lung disease. So in obstructive diseases, the problem is getting air out. An easy way to remember it is obstructive equals outflow problem. In restrictive lung diseases, the problem is different. We have restriction, meaning the lungs can't expand properly. They might be stiff, like scarred lung tissue and pulmonary fibrosis, or they might be limited by something around them, like in severe obesity, neuromuscular diseases, or chest wall disorders, like scoliosis. So the main problem is that the lungs can't expand properly, and it's hard for air to come in. This leads to smaller lung volumes overall, because the lungs just can't fill up with air as much as they should. So the inspiratory reserve volume is reduced, the expiratory reserve volume is reduced, and the residual volume is also reduced, so the total lung capacity is also reduced. Let's take a look at the flow volume loop. In restrictive diseases, the shape is basically the same, but everything is smaller. So the loop looks narrow and short, like a mini version of the normal one. Peak flow is normal or slightly reduced, but the total volume is low, and the graph is shifted to the right. In the forced expiratory volume graph, the curve is also the same, but the volumes are reduced. You can't blow out a big volume of air because you never took in a big volume to start with. So the FVC is reduced, and the FEV1 is also reduced, but is not as affected as an obstructive disease. Since both FEV1 and FVC drop proportionally, the FEV1 to FVC ratio stays normal or even increases. This is important. It tells us the problem isn't with airflow obstruction, but with lung volume. Remember, restrictive equals reduced lung volume. Here's a scheme for a recap. Feel free to pause the video. I hope this helped make lung volumes, lung capacities, and spirometry a little clearer. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your fellow students. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.